Have you ever stopped to think about how close you are to your own moral limit? We believe we are good people, that we would never do anything cruel or inhumane. But what if I told you that, under the right circumstances, you could become exactly what you despise the most? Imagine the following scenario. You are in an environment where no one is watching, where the rules you have always followed simply do not exist, where authority gives you permission to do whatever you want. Now, be honest. Would you still be the upright person you believe yourself to be? The truth is that evil is not a distant phenomenon. It does not belong only to the villains of history, to criminals, or to dictators. It is closer to you than you think, and the scariest part, it often starts subtly. Today we're going to explore an uncomfortable truth. What really makes us evil? To do this, we will dive into the work of Philip Zimbardo, author of The Lucifer Effect, and some of the most disturbing experiments in psychology. Get ready. What you are about to hear may forever change the way you see yourself and the world. Now tell me, do you really believe you are a good person? Most of us would answer yes, without hesitation. After all, we don't kill, we don't steal, we don't commit atrocities. But does that really mean we are morally incorruptible? The truth is, we like to think we are good. But this perception may be nothing more than an illusion. Think of something simple. Have you ever taken something that wasn't yours because you knew you wouldn't get caught? Maybe a pen from work? Or used your neighbor's Wi-Fi without permission? Small transgressions that seem harmless. But that's how it starts. Philip Zimbardo explains that evil rarely appears abruptly. It does not suddenly emerge like a switch being flipped. It infiltrates. It accumulates. It grows through small moral concessions. A small deviation here, another there. A lie that seems harmless. A slight abuse of power. And before you realize it, you have already crossed the line. The problem is, when that line disappears, what stops you from going even further? History is full of examples of ordinary people who, at some point, started with small missteps and ended up committing unthinkable acts, and if you were in their place, what would you do? The truth is that no one becomes evil overnight. Evil is a process, and the question you should ask yourself is not whether you are a good or bad person, but rather, what small concessions have you already made without realizing it? If evil is a process, then the question we should ask is not, who are the bad people, but rather, what makes an ordinary person cross that line? And to understand this, we need to talk about Ivan Frederick. He was not a criminal. He was not a psychopath. He was not someone who grew up with violent tendencies. He was an ordinary American soldier, an ordinary man, like you and me. But when he was sent to Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, everything changed. The environment around him was one of chaos, violence, and impunity. His superiors not only allowed but encouraged abuse against prisoners. And little by little, Ivan began to do things that, in any other context, he would never have imagined. He tortured, he humiliated, he abused people who were under his custody. And the scariest part, he wasn't the only one. Several soldiers who were once just ordinary young men began committing atrocities on a daily basis. What happened there? Zimbardo explains that the environment can transform any of us. When we are placed in a context where violence is normalized, where authority gives us permission, and where there are no apparent consequences, our morality dissolves. Ivan Frederick didn't wake up one day and decide to become a monster. He simply adapted to the environment he was placed in. And if it happened to him, what makes you think you would be any different? The truth is that evil does not need monsters to exist. It only needs an environment that allows it to flourish. And the question remains, if you were in his place, what would you do? We like to believe that we are unchangeable, that our values are solid, unbreakable. But the truth is that the environment has a much greater power over us than we imagine. And to prove this, we need to talk about one of the most shocking experiments. In psychology, the Milgram experiment. Imagine that you are participating in a scientific study. A researcher in a white lab coat tells you that you must administer electric shocks to another person whenever they give a wrong answer. At first, the shocks are mild, but as the experiment progresses, the voltage increases. The person on the other side begins to scream, to beg you to stop, and what do? Most people like to think they would refuse to continue, that they would stand up and say no. But the reality was very different. 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum shock of 450 volts. Even after hearing screams of pain, even knowing they were hurting someone. Why? Because a figure of authority said it was necessary. Does this mean these people were evil? No. It means that the environment and authority can lead us to do things we would never have imagined, and if this happened to ordinary people, what makes you think you would be different? The truth is, we are not as strong as we like to believe. Put any of us in the right environment, or rather the wrong environment, and we will see our morality bend, distort, until there is nothing left of it. If the Milgram experiment showed how authority can lead us to commit unthinkable acts, the Stanford prison experiment revealed something even more disturbing. What happens when we are given absolute power over others? And the answer is simple: power corrupts. Zimbardo decided to test how far the environment can shape human behavior. He took 24 university students, ordinary young men with no history of violence, and divided them into two groups, guards and prisoners. The idea was to simulate a prison inside Stanford University. At first, everything seemed like a game, but within hours, the guards began to abuse their power. They humiliated the prisoners. They forced them to do degrading things. Some even deprived them of food and sleep. And the scariest part? None of the guards were forced to act this way. They simply let themselves be carried away by the role they were given. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it had to be stopped in just 6 days. 6 days. That was all it took for ordinary young men to transform into something they never imagined. And what does this teach us? That power does not reveal who we are. It reveals who we can become. Give someone authority, impunity, and an environment that normalizes abuse. And watch what happens. Now think, how many times have you seen small demonstrations of this effect in your daily life? The boss who humiliates employees because he knows no one can challenge him, the police officer who abuses his power because he has a badge, the teacher who uses their position to intimidate students. Power, when unchecked, does not just corrupt, it transforms. But there is another, even more dangerous factor: blind obedience. Because sometimes the problem is not just with those who hold power. It is with those who follow orders without question, and few stories illustrate this better than the tragedy of Jonestown. Jim Jones was a charismatic leader. He founded a religious group and convinced thousands of people that he had all the answers. Over time, he led his followers to an isolated community in Guyana, where he had absolute control over their lives. And then, on November 18, 1978, he gave an order: everyone must drink poison and die together. And what happened? More than 900 people obeyed, men, women, children. They were not monsters. They were not violent fanatics. They were ordinary people, but they had become so accustomed to obeying that when the final moment came, they did not question it. And this leads us to an uncomfortable question. How many times have you obeyed without questioning? How many times have you followed orders just because someone in a position of authority said it was the right thing to do? History is full of tragedies caused not only by cruel leaders, but by ordinary people who simply followed orders. And if you had been there, if you had been in Jonestown or in any other moment in history where obedience was tested, what would you have done? The truth is that blind obedience can be just as dangerous as evil itself, and the only way to resist it is to question. Because in the end, it is not just those who give the orders who bear responsibility. It is also those who follow them. If blind obedience leads us to follow orders without questioning, there is another factor that can make us even more dangerous: the feeling that we are not responsible for our actions. Because when we feel that our identity dissolves into a group or that no one can hold us accountable, we become capable of things we would never do alone. And to understand this, we need to talk about a simple but terrifying experiment. A car was abandoned in a poor neighborhood in the Bronx, New York. Within a few hours, it was completely vandalized. Then the researchers did the same experiment in a wealthy neighborhood in Palo Alto, California, but this time the car remained untouched for days until they decided to break one of the windows, and then something curious happened. Within hours, the car was destroyed. What does this teach us? That when something seems abandoned, when no one seems responsible for it, people feel free to act without guilt. And this doesn't happen only with cars. The internet is a perfect example of this. People who, in real life, would never have the courage to insult someone become true monsters behind a screen because there, in anonymity, they feel that there are no consequences. And when there are no consequences, morality disappears. Now think, how many times have you seen this happen? People who, in a group, do things they would never do alone. People who, protected by anonymity, say things they would never have the courage to say face to face. The truth is that when we feel we are not responsible, we become dangerous, and the only way to resist this is to remember that no matter the context, every action is still a choice, because in the end, no one can escape their own conscience. If losing personal responsibility makes us act without guilt, there is one final step that can lead us to the worst side of humanity: dehumanization. Because to justify cruel acts, we first need to stop seeing the other as human, and history is full of examples of this. During the Holocaust, the Nazis did not call Jews people, they called them rats. During the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsis were called cockroaches before they were massacred, and this was not a coincidence, because when you reduce someone to an animal, an object, something inferior, hurting them becomes easier. And this doesn't happen only in wars. Dehumanization is present in our daily lives, in speeches that portray certain groups as the problem, in insults that reduce someone to a single characteristic, in moments when we ignore someone's suffering because we no longer see them as an equal. And psychology has proven this. Psychologist Albert Bandura conducted an experiment where a group of people was described as animals. The result? Participants were much more cruel to them, because when we stop seeing others as human, evil becomes justifiable. Now think, how many times have you seen this happen? In politics, in the media, on social media. Dehumanization doesn't start with violence, it starts with words, and the only way to resist this is to remember that behind every label, there is still a human being. Because the moment we forget that is the moment we become capable of anything. Dehumanization is one of the final steps toward evil, but there is a subtle and powerful tool that makes this process easier: language. Because before a cruel act is committed, it must be justified. And the most effective way to do this is to manipulate words. Words shape how we perceive reality, and when we change words, we change how people react. The Milgram experiment proved this. Participants were not instructed to harm someone, they were encouraged to help science. And that simple change in language was enough for them to follow orders without questioning. Words can soften the unacceptable, they can turn cruelty into something necessary, and the only way to resist this is to pay attention. Because when we accept and repeat certain words without questioning, we become part of the problem. If evil can infiltrate through small concessions, if the environment can transform us, if blind obedience and dehumanization can lead us to commit unthinkable acts, then how do we resist? The good news is that there is always a choice in the Milgram experiment, where 65% of people administered lethal shocks just because an authority figure ordered them to. There were those who refused. They questioned, they challenged authority. They said no, and that is the key, because evil thrives when no one resists. So how can we avoid falling into this trap? Here are 3 fundamental principles. Question authority. Not every order should be followed. Not every rule is just. If something feels wrong, stop and think. Take responsibility for your actions. The environment can influence you, but it cannot decide for you. Anonymity can hide you, but it cannot erase your choices. In the end, you are responsible for what you do. Recognize the humanity in others. The first step toward evil is seeing others as different. The first step to resisting is remembering that behind every label, there is still a human being. History shows us that evil does not need monsters to exist. It only needs ordinary people who choose not to question. And the question remains, when the moment comes to choose between good and evil, what will you do? If evil thrives when no one resists, then the only way to fight it is through heroism. But forget the idea that heroes are extraordinary figures with superhuman powers or unshakable courage. True heroism is not found in grand, epic feats. It is found in small, daily decisions. And to understand this, we need to talk about Wesley Autry. He was not a soldier. He was not a police officer. He was not a world leader. He was just an ordinary man waiting for the subway in New York with his 2 young daughters. Until suddenly, a young man had a seizure and fell onto the tracks. The train was already coming. The people around froze. No one knew what to do. But Wesley did not hesitate. He jumped onto the tracks and covered the young man's body with his own, pressing him against the ground as the train passed over them. When the train stopped, both were alive. And all of this happened in a matter of seconds. What made Wesley act when others hesitated? Zimbardo explains that heroism is not an innate quality, it is a choice, and that choice begins long before the critical moment. It begins when you decide to question what is wrong. When you refuse to follow orders blindly, when you take responsibility for your actions, when you see the humanity in others. Heroism is not about strength, it is not about supernatural courage, it is about acting when others remain paralyzed. And the question remains, when the moment comes to act, will you be a spectator or a hero? If there's one thing we've learned so far, it's that good and evil are not distant forces, separated by an unbreakable line. They exist within each of us, and contrary to what we like to believe, we are not as immune to the influence of our environment as we think. Evil does not appear suddenly. It infiltrates. It starts with small concessions, small abuses, small justifications. And by the time we realize it, we have already crossed the line. But the same is true for good. Heroism does not only happen in grand moments, it happens in small daily choices when you question an unjust order, when you take responsibility for your actions, when you refuse to dehumanize others. The truth is that we all have the potential for both good and evil, and in the end, what truly matters is not what you believe yourself to be, but the choices you make. So, when the moment comes to decide, what will your choice be? Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt pressured to act against your values? How did you react? Leave your comment below. Let's continue this conversation, and if this video made you reflect, share it with someone who also needs to hear this, because knowledge only has value when it is shared. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. See you soon, and until then remember, your choices define who you truly are.